Alina nervously paced from corner to corner of the room, clutching a parchment in her hands. The royal seal on it seemed to burn her fingers. She reread the monarch's harsh words for the second time, not believing her eyes. "Marry Ronan, my faithful commander, and become his lawful wife. This is my will and it is not open for discussion." Alina, the young duchess with hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes that sparkled like emeralds, couldn't imagine anything more dreadful. Her late husband, a wealthy duke, had barely crossed the threshold of life when vulturous relatives already circled his wealth like scavengers over carrion. And now the king, as a final blow, condemned her to marriage with a rough barbarian, to whom she owed nothing but the monarch's favor. "Ronan," she muttered, "possesses only the sword and brute strength. He knows nothing of refinement and etiquette." The thought of sharing her life, her bed, with this savage was unbearable. Alina clenched her fists. She wouldn't surrender without a fight. The next day, resolute, Alina arrived at the royal palace. Her eyes immediately found Ronan. He stood amidst the courtiers, towering like an oak, with a stern face and scars that scored his skin. His gaze, sharp as a dagger's edge, met hers. Alina felt a shiver run down her spine. "Duchess Alina," his booming voice sounded as he approached her. "I am Ronan." He was even more imposing up close. His tall figure seemed hewn from stone, and his hands, like a blacksmith's, could seemingly break chains. "I didn't expect you to be so young," he said, not hiding his surprise. "And I didn't expect you to be so—" Alina faltered, searching for the right word. "Barbaric," she finally uttered. Ronan frowned. "I am a warrior, Duchess. And I saved your king's life." "I understand that," Alina nodded. "But it doesn't give you the right." "The right to what?" Ronan sharply interrupted her. "To—" Alina stumbled again. She couldn't bring herself to say aloud that this rough warrior had no right to her bed. "To become your husband?" Ronan finished for her. Alina nodded silently. "Well," Ronan placed a hand on her shoulder. "I may know nothing of refinement and etiquette, as you say. But I know how to respect a woman. And I will be a faithful husband to you." His words sounded unexpectedly gentle. Alina felt her fear dissipate. Perhaps this barbarian wasn't as dreadful as she had thought. "I will try to be a good wife to you," she said. Ronan nodded. "I believe we can live happily." The wedding took place with royal pomp, but for Alina, it was more like a funeral for her former life. She sat at the long banquet table, surrounded by courtiers casting curious glances her way. Her only solace was the wine glass she discreetly sipped from to calm her nerves. Finally, the evening came to an end. Guests began to depart and the palace emptied. Alina made her way to her chambers, her heart fluttering like a bird in a cage. The doors opened and Ronan entered the room. He shrugged off his heavy cloak, revealing his sturdy chest. Alina involuntarily held her breath. "Duchess," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Do you need assistance with your toilette?" Alina shook her head, not daring to meet his gaze. "Very well," he said, and moved to the other end of the room, where a massive bed with a canopy stood. He sat on the edge, his figure looking solitary amidst the luxurious furnishings. Alina slowly undressed, shedding her elaborate gown and lace. Her exposed body felt vulnerable to her. She stared into the fireplace, trying to warm herself. Suddenly she heard the creak of the bed. Turning, she saw Ronan approaching her. He stopped at arm's length, his gray eyes smoky as mist, studying her intently. "You're beautiful," he murmured. Alina blushed. It was the first compliment she had received from him all day. but there was something unsettling in his gaze. "Don't be afraid, Duchess," he said softly. "I won't do anything you don't want." He moved to the bed slowly, each of his movements calm and deliberate. Alina lay on the edge of the bed, never taking her eyes off him. Ronan extinguished the candles and the room plunged into darkness. His warmth drew closer to her as he lay down beside her, covering them both with a single blanket. Alina smelled the scent of skin and sweat, the scent of a person who had spent a lifetime on the battlefield. She couldn't sleep. Her body was tense, her thoughts chaotic. This barbarian lay beside her, and she didn't know what to expect, tenderness or brute force. Suddenly she felt his hand on her waist. Her breath caught. But instead of gripping her, his hand moved slowly, gently, as if exploring unfamiliar territory. Alina closed her eyes, a wave of warmth washing over her body. She didn't understand what was happening to her. Fear was replaced by something else, something unfamiliar and exciting. The next morning, Alina woke to the sun's rays streaming through the window. She turned her head and saw Ronan peacefully sleeping beside her. He looked so calm, so vulnerable in sleep, nothing like the fearsome warrior she had imagined. Alina timidly reached out and touched his cheek. Ronan instantly opened his eyes and met her gaze. There was no surprise or anger in his eyes. Only warmth and something akin to relief. "Good morning, dear lady," he said, his voice husky from sleep. Alina felt her cheeks flush again. She had never allowed herself such liberties with her previous husband. "Good morning," she replied softly. A silence lingered between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. They were growing accustomed to each other, to this strange union fate had prepared for them. Suddenly the room's doors burst open with a clamor. A worried servant stood in the doorway. "Duchess," she blurted out, "relatives from your late husband's side have arrived. They demand an audience." Alina sighed. Peaceful life seemed elusive to her. She glanced at Ronan, who was already rising from the bed. "Stay here, my lord," she said. "I will handle them myself." She saw Ronan clench his fists. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Absolutely," replied Alina, radiating confidence she didn't truly feel. She proudly left the room, leaving Ronan alone with his thoughts. This marriage promised to be filled with surprises and, perhaps, even love. But above all, she needed to defend her independence and show this barbarian that she was not just a beautiful duchess, but also a strong woman capable of standing on her own. Alina entered the parlor where her relatives had already gathered. There were 5 of them, all haughty as peacocks. Their gazes slid over her with undisguised anger. "Alina," began the eldest among them, Uncle Theodore, a man with a fox-like face. "We've learned of your shameful marriage to this barbarian." Alina lifted her chin. "It's not a shameful marriage, uncle. It's the king's decree." "The king is an old fool," Aunt Agatha, a woman with a face like a sour lemon, snorted. "Couldn't he find you a more suitable husband?" "He found me a husband who saved his life," retorted Alina. "And that, in my opinion, is quite worthy." The relatives clamored, hurling accusations. They spoke of Ronan's unworthiness, of him taking her wealth, of her bringing shame to their family. Alina listened to their attacks, clenching her fists. She was no longer the young and frightened girl she once was. "Silence," she thundered, her voice ringing out like a bell. The room fell silent instantly. Alina surveyed her relatives with a stern gaze. "Firstly," she said, "I am Duchess Alina, and I alone decide whom to marry. Secondly, Ronan is a noble warrior who has earned the king's respect. And thirdly, if any of you try to take my property or harm me or my husband, I will personally appeal to the king. And believe me, you won't like the consequences." Her relatives were stunned into silence. They had never seen Alina so resolute. "We're leaving," muttered Uncle Theodore, and headed for the door, followed by the others. As the doors closed behind them, Alina allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. Her legs were trembling slightly, but she felt proud of herself. She had defended herself and her husband. Suddenly she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Impressive," said Ronan. Alina turned and saw him standing near the door. He crossed his arms over his chest, observing her with an unreadable expression. "You're nothing like the frightened girl I saw just a few days ago," he added. Alina approached him and stopped at arm's length. "I've learned a lot since my husband's death," she said. "And I won't allow anyone to intimidate me." She looked him in the eyes. "Even you, my lord?" Her voice hinted flirtatiously. For the first time since they met, she saw Ronan flustered. A blush rose to his cheeks. He averted his gaze. "No," he murmured. "No, of course not. You're a strong woman, Alina. And it seems I'm lucky with a wife." He reached out his hand to her. Alina placed her hand in his palm. His fingers were rough and calloused, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Perhaps I'm lucky too," she replied, smiling. They stood there for a while, the silence between them no longer awkward, but comfortable. Suddenly, a sharp sound of a trumpet rang out, signaling the arrival of guests. "It seems duty calls," said Ronan, releasing her hand with a hint of regret. Alina nodded. Their life was now filled not only with the contradictions between a tender duchess and a stern warrior, but also with duties to the king and the duchy. They walked out of the parlor together, ready to face the new challenges of fate. Alina was no longer afraid of the future. With this barbarian by her side, who, she began to understand, concealed strength, honor, and perhaps even tenderness beneath his rough exterior, she felt protected. Their marriage promised to be difficult, but it also promised to be filled with passion, discoveries, and perhaps even love, which would blossom like a beautiful rose amidst thorny bushes. And indeed, their life became a whirlwind of events. Alina quickly realized that Ronan was not only a brave warrior but also a wise strategist. He helped her navigate state affairs, and his advice was always sound. Alina, in turn, taught him court etiquette, albeit with a hint of mischief, watching the bewildered Ronan trying to remember all the rules. One day, neighboring lands attacked the duchy. Ronan, without hesitation, led the defense. Although Alina worried for her husband, she didn't sit idle. She organized food supplies for the soldiers, helped the wounded, and bolstered the morale of the people. During the day they were a duchess and a warrior, at night simply husband and wife. The intimacy that had once been daunting for Alina turned into a marvelous journey. She discovered sensuality within herself that she hadn't known before, and Ronan, despite his gruffness, proved to be a tender and attentive lover. Months passed and their feelings for each other grew stronger. They learned to appreciate each other, respecting the differences in their upbringing and temperament. Ronan became not just a husband to Alina but also a pillar of support and a friend. And Alina, for Ronan, was not only a wife but also a bright ray of light that illuminated his harsh warrior's life. One evening, sitting by the fireplace, Alina rested her head on Ronan's shoulder. The fire reflected in his gray eyes, making them warm and gentle. "Do you remember how scared I was of you at the beginning?" she whispered. Ronan smiled. "How could I forget? You were like a little frightened bird." Alina laughed. "And you, like a bear just emerging from hibernation." They fell silent, reminiscing about the early days of their strange union. "I never thought I'd fall in love with a barbarian," Alina said softly. Ronan gently kissed her on the temple. "And I never thought I'd find love with such a tender yet strong woman like you." They sat in silence, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the warmth of their hearts, now beating in unison. Their love story, which began with a king's decree and fear of the unknown, had turned into something more, a union of equals, a love that feared neither thorns nor harsh trials. Several years passed. Alina and Ronan became a model couple. They learned to combine their strengths for the good of the duchy. With Ronan's advice, Alina became a wise ruler, and under Alina's influence, Ronan softened his sternness and earned respect not only as a warrior but also as a fair leader. One morning, an excited messenger arrived at the castle. He brought news that a new, unknown enemy had appeared on the distant northern borders. Alina and Ronan exchanged glances. There was no fear in their eyes, only excitement. "Gather the army, my lord," Alina commanded. "We're going together." Ronan smiled. "As you wish, my lady." They knew that new trials awaited them ahead. But now they would face them together, side by side, the Duchess and her barbarian, brought together by fate and bound by love. Thank you for being with us today. I hope that this story has brought you emotions. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any of our new stories. Thank you for your support. You are the best.